The harsh wilderness of California's Trinity Alps, known for its rugged beauty, has long been a place of solitude for those seeking refuge in nature. But for one young man, it became a prison. His fate a chilling mystery that would baffle investigators for 5 long years. Jerick Vaughn, a 20-year-old adventurer, embarked on a solo hiking trip, hoping to conquer the wild terrain. But on August 18, 2005, he vanished without a trace, leaving only a photo and a cryptic message behind. What followed was an exhaustive search that spanned miles of inhospitable wilderness and yielded nothing. Until one fateful day when 2 hunters stumbled upon a chilling discovery, a bundle of buried clothing along with a heavy, twisted iron object that would unravel a dark secret hiding deep within the forest. What happened to Jerick Vaughn, and why was his clothing buried with a medieval torture device? Prepare yourself for a story more disturbing than any wilderness tale you've heard before. If you find yourself captivated by this eerie mystery, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and share this with anyone who loves a story that leaves you questioning what lies beneath the surface. Trust us, you won't want to miss what happens next. Jerick Vaughn, a 20-year-old with an affinity for the wilderness, set out alone to tackle the challenging terrain of the Trinity Alps. His goal was a 2-week solo expedition that would push his limits. Jerick was an experienced hiker, well-versed in navigating rough landscapes. He thrived in solitude, feeling more at home in the wild than anywhere else. This trip was meant to be his ultimate challenge. By August 22, 2005, the silence from Jerick's journey had become unbearable. His planned return had passed without a single word or sign of him. For his family, the waiting began to feel endless. His mother, Ara, knew her son's routines well. She wasn't immediately alarmed, as Jerick had often gone off-grid during past trips, but this time, the silence stretched too long. Something was wrong. Jerick was used to disconnecting from the world during his trips. No phones, no GPS devices, just pure nature. It was his way of finding peace after years of personal loss. Yet this time, he was late. Ara, growing more concerned, finally contacted authorities. The investigators began to piece together what they could about Jerick's trip. It was clear this wasn't a typical hiker's adventure. Jerick had vanished in a place where no one would easily find him. Trinity Alps is not a place for the unprepared. The wild landscape spans 500,000 acres, with deep canyons, dense forests, and granite cliffs. It is rugged, inhospitable, and unforgiving. Jerick had entered with no intention of being found. Initial search efforts were swift but unproductive. Authorities used helicopters, dogs, and ground teams, but found no trace of Jerick. His disappearance was like a ghost vanishing into thin air. It was as if the wilderness had swallowed him whole. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation grew cold. Ara's hope remained, though. She kept providing any new details she could, hoping that something, anything, would surface to explain her son's absence. But the wilderness held its secrets tightly. During the search, a witness came forward with a critical piece of information. Leander Horn, a wildlife photographer, claimed he had seen Jerick the day he disappeared. Jerick had been with an older man in an unusual interaction. Horn described the older man as weathered, with antique military gear, something that stood out in contrast to the high-tech equipment most hikers carried. Jerick had appeared engaged, walking off trail with this stranger, heading deeper into the uncharted wilderness. The witness statement shifted the investigation's focus. The assumption was that Jerick had simply wandered off with the older man, but as time passed, investigators began to wonder whether something darker had occurred. Had Jerick been led away, or had he chosen to follow? The case remained unsolved, but there was a shift. For 5 years, the cold case remained buried, along with the countless other mysteries that lay hidden in the depths of the Trinity Alps. No one knew the truth, not yet. The search for Jerick Vaughn had become a race against time. The vast and rugged Trinity Alps offered little hope. As the days stretched into weeks, every footstep in the wilderness felt like a lost opportunity. Jerick had been an expert at navigating these remote trails. His gear was top-notch, and he knew how to survive in the wild. But even the most experienced hiker can fall prey to nature's unforgiving unpredictability. The harsh terrain posed a challenge for search teams. Steep cliffs, dense forests, and unpredictable weather made it nearly impossible to track his movements. The lack of visible trails only intensified the mystery surrounding his disappearance. Despite the odds, search teams pushed forward, determined to uncover any trace of Jerick. They scoured the most likely spots first, the places Jerick would have been most likely to stop. But there were no signs of him. Tracking dogs, trained to pick up scent, struggled to find Jerick's trail. The dense underbrush and scattered rocks made it nearly impossible for them to follow a clear path. With each dead end, frustration mounted among the searchers. Jerick's mother, Ara, stayed in contact with authorities. She had an intimate knowledge of her son's habits and preferences, but there was little she could do beyond offering insight into his off-grid style of hiking. Weeks turned into months, and the emotional toll on those involved grew heavier. Ara clung to the hope that her son might be out there, waiting for rescue, somehow managing to survive despite the increasingly grim outlook. The search efforts were methodical but began to lose momentum. As the seasons changed, the wilderness became even more dangerous. Winter approached, with heavy snow threatening to complicate the search further. Despite the setbacks, authorities maintained their commitment. Jerick's photo was shared with as many locals and travelers as possible, hoping that someone might have seen him or heard something that could provide a clue. One key detail continued to haunt investigators. Jerick had sent a photo just days before his disappearance. It showed him smiling with a backpack, his eyes obscured by sunglasses. Yet, it was the photo's last frame that lingered in their minds. In the image, Jerick had mentioned encountering a group of tourists from Indonesia. The interaction seemed harmless, a moment of connection in the vast wilderness. But it was the last known communication that would come to define his disappearance. As the search stretched into its fourth week, hope began to fade. The realization that Jerick might not have survived began to settle in. The search was officially called off, but the investigation never fully ceased. Jerick's disappearance was a haunting mystery. The chilling possibility that something darker was at play lingered in the minds of those who had been involved in the search. Could Jerick have fallen victim to something more sinister than just the wilderness? Months passed, but the case remained open. For Ara, it felt like time had stopped. Her son's absence became an insidious void, pulling her into the shadows of the unknown. She had no answers, only endless questions. Then, nearly 5 years after Jerick vanished, 2 hunters were deep in the Trinity Alps, unaware of the significance their journey would soon hold. They were miles from the nearest trailhead, focused only on their quarry. In a remote, isolated part of the wilderness, they stumbled upon something strange, a disturbance in the earth. It was an animal's digging, but the exposed object wasn't an animal's kill. It was a bundle of clothing. Curiosity led the hunters to unearth the bundle. They were surprised to find a set of hiking gear, blue jackets, tan hats, and a leather satchel. The colors, familiar but haunting, were the same ones Jerick had been wearing in his last known photo. The discovery stopped them in their tracks. Buried with the clothing was something far more unsettling, an iron object. It looked ancient, its twisted, rusty design immediately sending a shiver down their spines. This wasn't just discarded gear. The hunters didn't know it then, but they had just unearthed the first tangible link to a 5-year-old mystery. What they had discovered would change the course of the investigation and expose a horrifying truth hidden in the wilderness. The discovery of Jerick's clothing was a breakthrough, but it only raised more questions. Why had the items been buried so meticulously? What did they reveal about the young hiker's fate and the mysterious stranger? The hunters, still shaken by their find, took the gear to the authorities. The connection to Jerick was clear, but the buried clothing offered no answers about his fate. The unsettling metal object was the real enigma. Investigators were baffled. Who would go to such lengths to conceal the belongings of a missing person? And why was the object buried alongside the gear? Was it an artifact, a weapon, or something more sinister? Forensic experts analyzed the clothing, confirming that it belonged to Jerick. The blue jacket, tan hat, and leather satchel matched the items he had been seen wearing in the photograph sent just before his disappearance. The link was undeniable. But the object, the strange iron mechanism, remained a mystery. Its design was unlike anything investigators had seen before. It looked old, almost medieval, with rust and grime coating its surface. What had Jerick been carrying, and why? As the investigation progressed, one crucial lead surfaced. Leander Horn, the wildlife photographer who had seen Jerick the day he disappeared, was contacted again. His initial statement about the encounter with an older man seemed more significant now. Horn had been observing the area from a distance when he saw Jerick with the older man. The interaction had seemed innocuous at first, but in the context of the disappearance, it now felt disturbingly out of place. The older man had been carrying military-style canvas gear, a sharp contrast to Jerick's modern hiking equipment. The stranger's appearance stood out, and Horn had noted the intensity of their conversation as they looked over a map together. Horn couldn't identify the man, but his detailed description was a crucial piece of the puzzle. He recalled how the two men had left the scenic overlook and ventured off the main trail, disappearing into the dense, unexplored wilderness. The sighting of the older man, along with his unusual gear, was now central to the investigation. Was he a guide, an eccentric local, or someone with darker intentions? The thought that he might be involved in Jerick's disappearance was becoming increasingly likely. Authorities focused on the location where Horn had seen Jerick and the stranger. This off-trail area was rugged and seldom traveled. The search teams combed the area, but once again, they came up empty. No sign of Jerick. The more the investigation deepened, the more the wilderness seemed to conceal its secrets. No trace of Jerick's footsteps, no abandoned campsites, no gear left behind, just the eerie silence of the mountains. It was as if he had vanished into the earth. The idea of foul play began to take hold. The strange man with the map, Jerick's sudden disappearance, and the discovery of his belongings buried in such a deliberate manner. These were not the signs of a simple accident. Something far darker was at play. A theory began to form among investigators. Perhaps Jerick had been led astray by the older man, who knew the mountains intimately. It was possible that he had been drawn off the path, far from where search teams were looking, into a hidden trap. But even with this new theory, there was little to go on. The search grew colder with each passing day, the wilderness still keeping its secrets tight. Jerick's case was becoming another mystery left unresolved, a haunting story that seemed to fade into the fog. The hunter's discovery had reignited hope, but it also intensified the fear of what might have happened to Jerick. The discovery of the strange object buried with his gear hinted at something far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. As the investigation into Jerick's disappearance stalled once more, the authorities had no choice but to step back, giving the case a new status: cold, unresolved, and seemingly forgotten by the wilderness that had taken him. But as the years passed, the mystery of Jerick Vaughn's disappearance would not be forgotten. The cryptic sighting of the older man and the disturbing object buried with his clothing would continue to linger, unanswered. 5 years had passed since Jerick Vaughn's disappearance, and the case had become one of those lingering mysteries, whispers of the lost hiker haunting the Trinity Alps. Yet on one fateful day, everything changed. 2 hunters, Mason Sykes and Leander Locke, were deep in the backcountry of the Trinity Alps. They were searching for a large bull elk, focusing solely on tracking the animal through the dense forest. As they moved through the thick underbrush, They reached a granite boulder formation. But what caught their attention wasn't the elk. It was a disturbance in the soil, freshly churned earth where an animal had been digging recently. The hunters, cautious but curious, approached the disturbed ground. They assumed it was a bear or coyote, drawn by some scent. But as they got closer, something unnatural caught their eyes, a corner of something buried in the soil. It wasn't animal remains or discarded trash. It was a large, heavy-duty sack, partially exposed. The hunters exchanged a look of confusion. What could this be doing deep in the wilderness, miles from any trail? Sykes cautiously tugged at the sack, pulling it free from the earth's grip. It resisted, weighted down by something inside. With a final pull, the sack was free, and they began to unroll it with rising unease. Inside, they found a collection of items: soiled, crumpled hiking gear, a blue jacket, a tan bucket hat, and a leather satchel. But what stood out most was the unmistakable color of the blue jacket. It was the same vibrant color Jerick had been wearing in his last known photo. Sykes's heart raced. This wasn't just any gear. This was Jerick's gear, buried, hidden, and long forgotten. The discovery sent a chill down his spine, and they both knew something was terribly wrong. But the discovery didn't end there. As Lockjack sifted through the clothing, his hand brushed against something hard and metallic, hidden within the folds of the blue jacket. He pulled it out slowly, eyes widening in disbelief. The object was rusted and unusual, about a foot long, shaped like an ancient tool, with segments that bloomed outward, forming a twisted flower-like shape. It looked like something out of history, almost like a medieval torture device. The hunters exchanged nervous glances. Sykes's voice trembled slightly as he muttered, "What in the world is this?" The object felt cold, heavy, and menacing in their hands. It was a piece of history. But why was it here? The atmosphere shifted. What had initially felt like a typical hunting trip now felt like something far darker. The woods, once serene, now felt oppressive. This wasn't just discarded clothing. It was a scene that suggested something terrible had happened. They knew they had to report their find. The gravity of the discovery hit them as they carefully rewrapped the clothing and the strange object, preparing to carry it back to civilization. Something had to be done. The journey back to the nearest sheriff's office was long, the weight of their discovery pulling at them. Every step through the forest now felt heavy with the knowledge that they had uncovered a piece of a much larger puzzle. Upon arriving, they immediately alerted authorities. The sheriff's office was soon in a frenzy. Jerick's disappearance was one of the most mysterious cases in the area, and now, 5 years later, a chilling clue had surfaced: clothing and an object that hinted at something sinister. The forensic team quickly got to work. The clothing was unmistakably Jerick's, but the object, a rusted medieval-like tool, was far more unsettling. It wasn't just a random artifact. It was a relic of pain, a device designed to inflict suffering. The authorities knew they had to investigate further. This wasn't just a case of a hiker lost to the wilderness. The discovery hinted at something far more calculated, something far more deliberate. Jerick had not just vanished. As investigators processed the items found by the hunters, they knew this discovery was more than a clue. It was the key to unlocking Jerick's mysterious fate. But the path forward was filled with uncertainty. Forensic experts immediately focused on the clothing, cross-referencing it with Jerick's last known photograph. The vibrant blue jacket, tan hat, and leather satchel matched the items Jerick had been wearing on his final hike. The connection was clear. But the true mystery lay in the strange object found buried with the gear. The metal object was unlike anything they had seen before. It looked ancient, crafted with meticulous detail, and designed for a specific, dark purpose. The forensic team sent the object for further analysis. Early reports confirmed that it was a pair of anguish, an archaic medieval torture device. Its design was terrifying, a cruel tool meant to inflict unimaginable pain on its victim. The implications of this discovery were chilling. Jerick's disappearance had not been an accident. The evidence pointed to something far darker, a calculated, sadistic act. But who had brought this device into the wilderness? DNA analysis of the clothing offered another breakthrough. While the items had been buried for years, they were remarkably well preserved. Samples were taken from the jacket's collar and the satchel's interior. The results were shocking. Jerick's DNA was confirmed. The identification was conclusive. But there was still no sign of his body. The discovery of his clothes and the torture device deepened the mystery. Where was Jerick's body? What had happened to him? As authorities pieced together the evidence, they began to re-examine the old witness statement from Leander Horn. Horn had seen Jerick with an older man the day he disappeared, a man carrying military-style gear, which now seemed highly significant. The description of the older man fit the profile of someone experienced in survival tactics. He was well-equipped and knowledgeable about the wilderness, making him an ideal person to lead someone like Jerick off the trail and into danger. Investigators now had a suspect, but they needed more. They began to focus on the location where the strange object had been discovered, deep within the Trinity Alps, a place far from established trails and frequently traveled paths. The terrain around the burial site was harsh and unforgiving. The discovery had been made miles from any regular hiking route, suggesting that whoever had buried Jerick's belongings knew the area well, perhaps better than the average hiker. As the investigation continued, authorities uncovered more disturbing details. The pair of anguish was a brutal reminder of the sadistic nature of the crime. It wasn't just about survival or an unfortunate accident. It was about pain and torture. With every new revelation, the sense of unease grew. Jerick had not been simply lost in the wilderness. He had been targeted. The meticulous burial of his gear and the presence of the torture device pointed to a deliberate act of violence. Forensic experts worked tirelessly to determine the full extent of Jerick's suffering. The absence of his body suggested a cold, calculated disposal, but the device, buried with his belongings, painted a clear picture of the horror he had endured. The search for Jerick's remains intensified. Investigators combed the wilderness, using ground-penetrating radar and other tools to locate possible burial sites. Yet despite their efforts, the landscape seemed to keep its secrets. Jerick's body remained elusive. The forensic evidence and the chilling discovery of the pair of anguish only raised more questions. Why had the killer chosen to bury Jerick's belongings, yet leave his body behind? What was the significance of the location, and why had it been so carefully concealed? As the investigation moved forward, the presence of the torture device became central to understanding the crime. Whoever had done this had a dark, twisted interest in pain and suffering, a knowledge of ancient methods of torture that was chilling and incomprehensible. The authorities were no closer to finding Jerick's body, but the evidence was undeniable. Jerick's fate had been sealed long before he vanished into the wilderness, and now the truth was beginning to take shape, piece by piece. As the investigation into Jerick Vaughn's disappearance deepened, the evidence pointed to something far darker than anyone had imagined. The pair of anguish, the hidden burial site, and the mysterious stranger left no room for doubt. Investigators began focusing on the older man seen with Jerick in the days leading up to his disappearance. Leander Horn's testimony had become more significant than ever. The man in the military-style gear seemed to be the key. The description Horn provided of the man was vague, but it was enough to create a profile. The older man had been well-versed in the wilderness, capable of navigating the harsh terrain with ease. He had likely known how to evade authorities. Law enforcement began their search for anyone matching the description of the stranger. They interviewed locals, hiked into remote areas, and searched through years of records. But the task was daunting. There were too many possibilities. The wilderness surrounding the Trinity Alps was full of eccentric individuals, survivalists, veterans, and loners who sought refuge in its vast expanse. Locating the mysterious man seemed like finding a needle in a haystack. The next breakthrough came when investigators reviewed the maps and documents found in the wilderness cabin. They were detailed, showing obscure routes and hidden spots in the Alps. These maps, marked with strange symbols, had been crafted by someone intimately familiar with the region. The investigation shifted focus. The symbols on the maps, initially dismissed as mere notes, were now seen as deliberate markings. They pointed to specific locations, places the killer might have frequented. The search became more targeted. The more they learned about the stranger, the more chilling the situation became. This was no ordinary hiker. This was someone who had lived in the mountains long before Jerick ever set foot in them. He was a shadow in the wilderness. Investigators began to dig into the small towns surrounding the Alps. They spoke to locals, particularly those who had lived in the area for years. Some mentioned a man who had lived on the fringes of society, a recluse with a violent temper. The search for this man, now identified as Idris Rook, gathered steam. He was a Cold War veteran, someone who had served in covert operations. His training in psychological operations and survival skills made him a formidable and elusive target. Rook was known to disappear for months at a time, always reappearing in small towns near the wilderness, taking menial jobs before vanishing once again. His behavior was erratic, and he had a reputation for being unpredictable. The authorities began to focus on Rook as a primary suspect. They tracked his movements, monitored his actions, and even attempted to follow him as he disappeared into the forest. But Rook was always one step ahead, vanishing as quickly as he arrived. Despite the mounting evidence, Rook remained elusive. His survival skills, honed through years of military training, allowed him to blend into the wilderness. He knew how to cover his tracks and avoid detection by the authorities. The investigation took on a new intensity. The search for Rook became a manhunt, one that would take investigators deep into the heart of the Trinity Alps. They knew that if they were going to find answers, they would have to outwit a man who had lived in these mountains for decades. Months passed without a significant lead, but the authorities remained vigilant. Every day brought them closer to the truth. They knew that finding Rook was the key to understanding what had happened to Jerick Vaughn. The search for Jerick's killer seemed endless, but the investigators remained determined. Rook's background, his survival skills, and the mounting evidence pointed to him as the perpetrator. They knew that the next step was to locate him, no matter the cost. As the manhunt intensified, the truth about Jerick's disappearance and the identity of his killer began to emerge. The mountains, once a place of tranquility, had become the setting for a chilling crime. The hunt for Rook was on. The search for Idris Rook intensified as investigators believed they were closing in on their suspect. They had his name, his background, and a profile that made it clear he was familiar with the remote wilderness. Rook had been living in the outskirts of society for years. His time in the military, particularly his Cold War experience, had shaped him into a reclusive survivalist who could easily blend into the harshest environments. Authorities knew that finding Rook's base of operations was crucial. The wilderness of the Trinity Alps was vast, and he had learned to use the terrain to his advantage, disappearing into its remote corners without a trace. As the investigation progressed, the focus shifted from town interviews to the wilderness itself. Authorities speculated that Rook had a hidden shelter deep within the mountains, a place where he could live undisturbed, away from prying eyes. Aerial surveillance was used to scan the forested areas for any signs of unusual activity. The mountainous terrain presented a challenge, but the technology available provided a glimmer of hope. They were determined to find Rook's lair. It was a delicate operation. Rook was an expert in survival and evasion. The longer he had lived in the mountains, the more adept he became at hiding, using his military training to cover his tracks with precision. Months passed. and the authorities struggled to pinpoint Rook's location. The clues from his past and the dark artifacts discovered in his cabin suggested he had meticulously planned every aspect of his existence, leaving little to chance. Rook's hidden cabin was more than just a shelter. It was a carefully constructed refuge that allowed him to live without detection. Investigators knew that finding this elusive cabin could provide them with the answers they desperately needed. In early 2011, a breakthrough occurred. Aerial surveillance captured an anomaly, a faint thermal signature in a remote ravine, far from any regular trail. It was enough to prompt a closer inspection by ground teams. The ravine was treacherous, with steep slopes and dense forest blocking easy access. A specialized team of searchers was deployed to investigate the area. They were prepared for anything, but they had no idea what awaited them. After days of searching, they found it, a small camouflaged structure tucked into the hillside. The cabin was almost invisible from the air, expertly concealed by the surrounding trees and rocky outcrops. Rook had outdone himself in hiding his hideaway. The discovery of Rook's cabin marked a turning point in the investigation. It was a key moment, signaling that they were on the right track. But the question remained: what would they find inside? And more importantly, was Rook still there? The tactical team approached with caution, knowing that Rook was dangerous. They suspected he had been living there for years, and they couldn't afford to underestimate him. The risk of an ambush was real. When they reached the cabin, they found it well equipped, with supplies and tools, suggesting that Rook had made it his permanent residence. It was a self-sufficient shelter, designed for long-term survival in the harsh wilderness. Inside, they uncovered disturbing evidence of Rook's violent tendencies. The cabin was filled with strange objects, medieval torture devices, animal bones, and detailed records documenting cruel experiments. It was clear that Rook had been using the cabin for far more than survival. The authorities meticulously combed through the cabin, looking for anything that could connect Rook to Jerick Vaughn. They found evidence of animal torture, as well as a collection of detailed maps that seemed to indicate potential sites for future operations. Despite the gruesome discoveries, there was still no direct link between Rook and Jerick. The investigators knew they needed more, something that would conclusively tie Rook to the young hiker's disappearance and the horrors he had endured. Rook's cabin revealed a man obsessed with control and power. His interest in pain and suffering was evident in the items he had collected. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of cryptic notes and markings that suggested Rook had planned something far more sinister. As the investigation into the cabin continued, authorities began to suspect that Rook's base of operations was just the tip of the iceberg. They believed that he had a larger network of hidden locations, each one potentially holding more evidence of his dark activities. The discovery of Idris Rook's hidden cabin brought investigators closer to the truth, but the hunt wasn't over. Rook, a seasoned survivalist with military training, was still out there, evading capture. Authorities now knew Rook's methods, his ability to blend into the wilderness, his obsession with pain and control, and his cruel past. But finding him, let alone apprehending him, seemed like an insurmountable challenge. Rook's cabin provided chilling insights into his psyche. The animal torture, the detailed maps, the archaic weapons, all spoke to a man lost in his own darkness. But there was still no sign of Jerick. Investigators continued to track Rook's movements, analyzing the data from the surveillance operation. The evidence pointed toward a remote location deep in the Trinity Alps, a place far from civilization, hidden in plain sight. Despite his careful planning, Rook could not remain completely undetected. His movements, while calculated, were not perfect. The authorities were closing in, and they knew that this manhunt could soon come to an end. Rook had been living off the grid for years, but the increasing pressure from the investigation began to take its toll. He was still the predator, but the net was slowly tightening around him, and time was running out. A specialized tactical team was assembled to conduct a high-risk operation, They were ready to confront Rook, but they knew the dangers of the terrain and Rook's unpredictable nature. The wilderness was his domain. In the early hours of March 12, 2011, the operation began. The team moved cautiously, using the cover of darkness to approach Rook's suspected location. They knew the importance of surprise in this high-stakes situation. As the team advanced through the rugged terrain, the atmosphere was thick with tension. They were close now. They had spent months searching, and the moment of confrontation was at hand. The woods were eerily silent. The tactical team arrived at the location and found a figure lying motionless on the ground. Weapons raised, they approached with caution, ready for anything. It was Rook, dead from an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. The realization hit them hard. The manhunt, the long pursuit through the wilderness, had come to a tragic end. Rook had chosen to take his own life rather than face justice. The ghost of the Trinity Alps had been silenced. The authorities secured the scene and confirmed Rook's identity. A firearm was found nearby, and the coroner confirmed that the cause of death was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Rook had made his final escape. Rook's death brought closure to the investigation, but it also raised more questions. Had he been responsible for Jerick Vaughn's murder? The evidence pointed to him, but the mystery of Jerick's final moments remained unsolved. For Jerick's family, the discovery of his body and the identification of Rook as the killer was bittersweet. The haunting truth had been revealed, but the grief of losing Jerick was a burden they would carry forever. The search for Jerick's body, which had remained elusive for so long, was finally resolved when investigators located his remains in a remote ravine. The discovery was a painful confirmation of the tragedy that had unfolded in the Alps. Jerick's body, though partially mummified due to the conditions of the ravine, showed clear signs of prolonged torture. The injuries were consistent with the use of the pair of anguish and other devices found at Rook's cabin. With Jerick's remains identified and the evidence linking Rook to the crime, the authorities were able to piece together the horrifying events that led to Jerick's death. Rook had been the predator, and Jerick the tragic prey. The news of Rook's death and the discovery of Jerick's body sent shockwaves through the small mountain community. What had once been a cautionary tale of a hiker lost in the wild had now become something far more sinister. Jerick Vaughn, Jerick's mother, finally had the closure she had longed for. While the pain of losing her son remained, knowing the truth about his fate allowed her to begin the painful process of healing. Idris Rook's death marked the end of one chapter, but it was not the end of the story. The wilderness, once a place of solitude and beauty, had become the backdrop for a dark and tragic tale that would haunt the Trinity Alps forever.